Early 1941. The Admiralty Room of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. The air is thick with the scent of green tea, aged wood, and the iron will of an empire at the zenith of its confidence. Here, amidst maps of the Pacific Ocean that are soon to be redrawn, the finest minds of the Japanese naval establishment are finalizing the plans for a war they believe to be not only necessary, but preordained. Men like Admiral Osamu Nagano and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, brilliant strategists steeped in the traditions of Admiral Togo and the decisive victory at Tsushima, look at the strategic calculus with a cold, hard clarity. They see the American industrial giant, the sleeping dragon across the ocean, but they believe it to be a clumsy, materialistic, and spiritually weak opponent. Their entire naval philosophy is built upon a single glorious concept, the Kentai Kessen, the decisive battle. This doctrine dictates that Japan, with its limited resources, cannot win a long war of attrition. Victory must be swift and absolute. A single crushing blow, delivered by their magnificent battleships and their superb carrier fleet, will cripple the American Navy, shatter its morale, and force a negotiated peace that recognizes Japan's supremacy in Asia. In this grand operatic vision of naval warfare, every weapon has its role. The battleships are the samurai swords, the carriers are the swift cavalry, and the cruisers are the loyal retainers. And the submarines. In the Japanese view, their submarines, the powerful I-boats, are the ninja, the scouts, the assassins, designed to stalk and sink enemy warships in advance of the main fleet action. The idea of using these noble complex weapons to sink grubby merchant ships, the lowly maru, is seen as a wasteful and dishonorable diversion of resources. When they look across the Pacific at the American submarine force, their assessment is one of dismissive contempt. They see a small, outdated fleet of S-class boats, derisively known to their own crews as pig boats, cramped, foul-smelling, and mechanically unreliable. They see a doctrine that is timid, overly cautious, and like their own focused on fleet support rather than commerce raiding. They see an officer corps that is conservative and uninspired. Their intelligence tells them correctly that the American submarine is a secondary weapon, an afterthought in a navy obsessed with the glamour of the battleship. So, as they plan their great gamble, the American submarine force is dismissed as a negligible threat. It is a joke, a footnote in their meticulous calculations of victory. They could not possibly comprehend that this weapon they so thoroughly mocked would become the instrument of their empire's slow, agonizing, and absolute strangulation. They believed the war would be decided by the thunder of December 7, 1941. As the bombs rain down on Pearl Harbor, the American submarine force has its first ignominious taste of the war. Several U.S. submarines are present at the naval base, some moored, some in dry dock. They are helpless spectators to the destruction of the battle fleet they are sworn to protect. The USS Narwhal, the USS Dolphin, the USS Cachalot, the USS Tautog, all are there, and all are powerless. The Tautog, moored at the submarine base, manages to bring its machine guns into action, claiming to have shot down a Japanese torpedo bomber, the first warship to score a kill in the Pacific War. But it is a hollow victory. The great strategic weapon that was supposed to contest the Pacific is reduced to the role of a floating anti-aircraft battery. In the chaotic hours and days that follow, the submarines at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines are sent out on hasty, ill-conceived patrols. Their orders are confused, their targets are phantoms, and their results are zero. For the Japanese command, but in Washington, D.C., a decision is made that will change the course of the war, a decision born of rage and desperation. On the afternoon of December 7th, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark issues a terse, electrifying order to all naval forces: execute UN-restricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. This is a momentous command. It is a direct contravention of the international naval treaties that America itself had championed, which mandated that submarines surface and give warning before sinking merchant vessels. It is a declaration of total war, an acknowledgement that this will be a war not of rules and honor, but of national survival. It is an order that unleashes the American submarine force, freeing it from its doctrinal shackles and giving it a single brutal mission: sink anything flying a Japanese flag. The problem is, in the winter of 1941, and for the long desperate year of 1942, the American submarine force is simply not up to the task. The skippers are brave, the crews are dedicated, but their boats are obsolete, and most critically, their primary weapon is a catastrophic failure. The story of the American submarine war in the Pacific cannot be understood without first understanding the scandal of the Mark 14 torpedo. The Mark 14 was on paper a technological marvel. Developed in secret at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, during the interwar years, it was designed to be the deadliest weapon in the world. It was a steam-powered torpedo, faster and with a longer range than its predecessors. But its true genius, the Navy believed, was its revolutionary new exploder, the Mark 6. This was a magnetic influence fuse, designed not to strike the side of an enemy ship, but to run underneath its keel and be detonated by the ship's magnetic field. The resulting explosion from below would break the ship's back, sinking it with a single devastating blow. It was a war-winning weapon, and the Bureau of Ordnance Board, the powerful and insular bureaucracy that designed the Navy's weapons, was so confident in its effectiveness that they had built the entire supply, over 1,000 torpedoes, in complete secrecy, forbidding any live-fire testing for fear of revealing its existence to the enemy. It was a decision of such staggering arrogance and incompetence that it would cost the lives of thousands of American submariners and prolong the war by months, if not years. As the first American submarines, the old S-boats and the newer fleet boats of the Sargo and Salmon classes, venture out into the newly conquered Japanese empire, a pattern of maddening frustration begins to emerge. Skippers, men of incredible courage and skill, would perform feats of breathtaking seamanship, stalking enemy convoys, penetrating heavily defended harbors, and achieving perfect attack positions. They would fire their torpedoes, hear the satisfying sound of the weapon running hot, straight and normal, and then, nothing. Or worse, a premature explosion far from the target. The letters and patrol reports from these early skippers are a litany of anguish. Commander Tyrell D. Jacobs of the USS Sargo, after firing 8 torpedoes at a Japanese tanker at point-blank range with no result, wrote in his log, "It is a fact that the torpedoes are running deeper than set." He was right. The first flaw of the Mark 14 was that its depth-keeping mechanism was faulty. The torpedoes were running a full 10 feet deeper than their settings. Against shallow draft destroyers, this was a miss. Against a large tanker, it meant the torpedo would pass harmlessly underneath the ship. The problem was that the board had tested the depth mechanism with a dummy warhead, which was lighter than the live, TNT-filled warhead, causing the torpedo to run deeper in actual combat conditions. It was a basic scientific error, one that could have been caught with a single live fire test. Frustrated skippers began to compensate, setting their torpedoes to run at 0 depth. This helped, but then the second flaw revealed itself: the magnetic exploder. The Mark 6 fuse was a delicate, complex piece of machinery, a collection of magnets and firing pins that was supposed to be a marvel of precision. In reality, it was a disaster. The Earth's own magnetic field could set it off, causing the torpedo to explode hundreds of yards from its target. Skippers would watch in horror as their perfectly aimed shot would detonate in a useless plume of water, alerting the entire convoy to their presence and bringing a rain of depth charges down upon them. By mid-1942, many of the more aggressive and skeptical skippers, men like Dudley Mush Morton of the legendary USS Wahoo, were taking matters into their own hands. Before a patrol, they would order their torpedo crews to perform illicit surgery on the Mark 6 exploder, deactivating the magnetic feature and relying solely on the contact pistol, which was supposed to detonate the warhead upon impact with the side of a ship. It was an act of technical rebellion against the high command, a vote of no confidence in the wonder weapon they had been given. But even this was not enough, for the Mark 14 had a third, and even more infuriating, flaw. The contact exploder didn't work. Skippers who had solved the depth problem and deactivated the magnetic fuse now found themselves scoring perfect, solid hits on the sides of enemy ships, only to be rewarded with a dull, metallic clang. The torpedo would either bounce off, fail to detonate, or in some horrifying cases, circle back and threaten the submarine that had fired it. The firing pin mechanism in the contact pistol was too delicate. If the torpedo struck the target at a perfect 90-degree angle, it would often crumple on impact, absorbing the shock and preventing the firing pin from striking the detonator cap. It was a weapon that punished a perfect shot. For nearly 2 years, the skippers on the front lines pleaded with the Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge the problem. And for 2 years, the admirals and engineers at board, cocooned in their stateside laboratories, refused to believe it. They blamed the skippers, accusing them of poor marksmanship, faulty maintenance, or simply cowardice. It was a classic case of a bureaucracy refusing to admit its own catastrophic failure. The disconnect between the frontline reality and the rear echelon dogma was absolute. The man who would finally break this deadlock was a gruff, brilliant and fiercely loyal admiral named Charles A. Lockwood. When he took command of the Pacific submarine fleet in early 1943, he was a breath of fresh air. Unlike the bureaucrats in Washington, Lockwood listened to his skippers. He read their patrol reports, he heard their stories of frustration and rage, and he believed them. He decided to do what board had refused to do for 2 years, conduct his own scientifically rigorous tests. In a series of ingenious, almost comically simple experiments in the waters off Australia, Lockwood's staff finally proved what every submariner already knew. To test the depth mechanism, they fired torpedoes through fishing nets, measuring the height of the holes. They found the torpedoes were indeed running 10 feet too deep. To test the contact exploder, in a now legendary act of insubordination, Lockwood's ordnance officer, the brilliant Commander Swede Momsen, ordered live torpedo warheads to be dropped from a crane from a height of 90 feet onto solid steel plates, simulating a perfect 90-degree impact. The first 2 were duds. They had finally irrefutably proven that the contact pistol was a failure. The results of these tests, sent back to Washington, were a bombshell. Faced with undeniable proof, the Bureau of Ordnance was finally forced to act. They rushed to design and produce a new, simpler, more robust contact pistol, one with a stronger firing pin and a more reliable trigger mechanism. By late 1943, the new torpedoes were beginning to reach the fleet. The key that would unlock the full, terrifying potential of the American submarine force had finally been forged. While the torpedo scandal was being resolved, another, equally important revolution was taking place. The old, timid doctrine was being swept away, and the obsolete S-boats were being replaced by a new class of vessel that would become the stuff of legend, the fleet submarine. The Gato Barlow and Tench-class boats were not just submarines. They were the most complex and technologically advanced weapons systems of their time. These were huge vessels over 300 feet long, with a range of over 11,000 miles. They were in effect submersible cruisers, capable of staying at sea for months at a time. And unlike the cramped, foul-smelling pig boats, the fleet boats were designed for habitability. They had air conditioning, a luxury unheard of in any other Navy's submarines, which was a lifesaver in the sweltering tropical waters of the Pacific. They had freshwater distillation units, allowing the crew to take showers. They had bunk beds, a mess hall that showed movies, and a galley that produced some of the best food in the US military, including the now famous submarine tradition of ice cream. This focus on crew comfort was not a sign of American softness, it was a calculated weapon of war. A well-rested, well-fed and comfortable crew could endure the crushing psychological strain of a 60-day war patrol and still be at peak efficiency when the moment of combat arrived. But the true superiority of the fleet boat lay in its electronic nervous system. It was equipped with 2 types of radar. The SD air search radar was a small retractable antenna that could be raised above the surface while the submarine was still submerged at periscope depth. It could detect approaching aircraft, giving the skipper precious minutes to dive to safety. This single piece of technology rendered the Japanese anti-submarine patrol planes, which had been a constant terror, largely ineffective. The second radar, the powerful SJ surface search radar, could be used on the surface at night. It could detect a convoy from over 20 miles away, allowing the submarine to track its course and speed with perfect accuracy and set up an ideal attack position without ever being seen. The Japanese, who were years behind in radar technology, were effectively blind at night. For the American submariner, the darkness, which had once been a source of fear, was now a cloak of invisibility, a perfect hunting ground. And at the heart of the conning tower, the brain of the entire was a device that was for its time as revolutionary as the computer, the Torpedo Data Computer, or TDC. This was a complex analog computer, a bewildering collection of gears, dials and gyroscopes, that solved the complex mathematical problem of hitting a moving target with a moving torpedo from a moving submarine. The sonar operator would feed in the target's bearing and range. The skipper through his periscope would estimate the target's speed and angle on the bow. The TDC would take all this data, along with the submarine's own course and speed, and in a matter of seconds, it would calculate the precise gyro angle, the course the torpedo needed to take to intercept the target. It was a marvel of mechanical computation, and it gave the American skipper a degree of accuracy that the Japanese, who relied on manual calculations and instinct, could not hope to match. With the new torpedoes, the new boats and the new technology, all that was needed was a new breed of commander. Men like Charles Lockwood and his counterpart in the Southwest Pacific, Admiral Ralph Christie, began to promote a new generation of skippers, young, aggressive and fiercely independent men who were willing to take calculated risks. The old cautious doctrine of avoiding heavily defended convoys was thrown out. The new doctrine was simple: go get them. The results were immediate and spectacular. The year 1944 would become known in the submarine force as the Great Submarine Offensive. With the new reliable Mark 18 electric torpedo supplementing the now fixed Mark 14, the American submarine force was finally unleashed. They began to systematically dismantle the Japanese merchant marine, the Maru, which was the lifeblood of the Japanese Empire. Japan is an island nation, a workshop that is almost completely devoid of the raw materials of modern warfare. It has no oil, it has no rubber, it has no iron ore, it has no bauxite for aluminum. Every single drop of fuel for its Zeros and its battleships, every single sheet of steel for its tanks and its guns, had to be imported by sea from its newly conquered empire in Southeast Asia, from the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the iron mines of Manchuria. The Japanese merchant marine, the fleet of tankers and freighters that plied these vital sea lanes, was the silent, invisible artery that kept the heart of the Japanese war machine beating. And it was this artery that the American submarines now began to sever. The main battleground was the Luzon Strait, the deep channel between the Philippines and Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. This was the choke point through which all the oil tankers from the south had to pass on their way to the home islands. The American submariners grimly nicknamed it Convoy College, and they turned it into a slaughterhouse. They would lie in wait, submerge during the day, and then surface at night, using their superior radar to find the Japanese convoys. They would then attack on the surface, a tactic of incredible audacity. A surfaced submarine was a small, fast, and highly maneuverable target, and it could use its deck guns to supplement its torpedoes. The Japanese escorts, the Kaiboken, were too few, too slow, and lacked the radar to effectively counter these terrifying night attacks. The stories of the skippers who fought in Convoy College are the stuff of legend. Men like Dudley Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo, who in a single patrol in 1943, sailed into the supposedly safe waters of the Yellow Sea and sank an entire convoy, an act of such daring that it electrified the entire submarine force. Or Richard O'Kane, Morton's former executive officer, who took command of the USS Tang and became the highest-scoring American submarine ace. In his final legendary patrol, O'Kane and his crew sank 10 Japanese ships in a single night attack, a feat of almost unbelievable aggression. The Tang's final tragic end was a testament to the dangers these men faced. Its last torpedo, a faulty Mark 18, malfunctioned and ran in a circle, striking the Tang and sending her to the bottom. O'Kane and a handful of his crew were the only survivors, a story of triumph and tragedy that encapsulated the brutal reality of the submarine war. The statistics of this campaign are the true measure of its devastating effectiveness. The mathematics of strangulation were being written in the logbooks of the submarine fleet. In 1942, American submarines sank just over 1 million tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, as the torpedo problems began to be solved, that number jumped to nearly 3 million tons. In 1944, with the full force of the fleet boats and their new torpedoes unleashed, they sank over 5 million tons, including nearly 90% of Japan's tanker fleet. By 1945, the Japanese merchant marine had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. The impact on the Japanese war effort was catastrophic. It was a slow-motion industrial heart attack. The oil imports, which had been over 16 million barrels in 1941, were reduced to less than 2 million barrels in 1944, and virtually zero in 1945. The great battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy,
the pride of the fleet, were reduced to floating anti-aircraft batteries, anchored in the home islands, because there was no fuel to send them to sea. The pilot training program, once the best in the world, collapsed. Student pilots were lucky to get 30 hours of flight time, often using fuel made from pine roots, because there was no aviation gasoline. The aircraft factories, which were supposed to be producing new advanced fighters to counter the American B-29s, were starved of aluminum and other vital materials. The Japanese civilian population was facing starvation, as the submarines had also sunk the ships that brought in food from the mainland. The Japanese anti-submarine warfare (ASW) effort was a case of too little, too late. Their doctrine, which had dismissed the submarine threat, had left them completely unprepared. They lacked the radar, the sonar, and the mass production capacity to build the hundreds of escort vessels needed to protect their convoys. Their depth charges were set too shallow, their tactics were reactive, and their entire ASW effort was given a low priority by a naval high command that was still obsessed with the idea of a decisive surface battle. They were trying to plug 1,000 leaks in a burst dam with only their bare hands. Even in the arena of the decisive battle, the one place the Japanese thought they were supreme, the American submarines delivered devastating blows. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the USS Albacore torpedoed and sank the brand new Japanese aircraft carrier Tai-Ho, the flagship of Admiral Ozawa's fleet. A few hours later, the USS Kavala sank the veteran carrier Shokaku, one of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. 2 of the most powerful warships in the world, sunk by 2 lone submarines, a perfect illustration of the shifting balance of naval power. And in November 1944, the USS Archerfish achieved the ultimate prize, sinking the gigantic 72,000-ton aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest warship in the world, at the time, on her maiden voyage. By the spring of 1945, the submarine force had largely worked itself out of a job. There were simply no more targets to sink. In the final phase of the war, they took on a new role: lifeguards. Submarines were stationed along the flight paths of the B-29s that were now firebombing Japan. When a bomber was damaged and had to ditch in the ocean, the crew knew that a lifeguard submarine was waiting below to pick them up. Hundreds of American airmen were saved in this way, another testament to the versatility and importance of the submarine force. When the war ended, and the American analysts of the Strategic Bombing Survey began to sift through the wreckage of the Japanese Empire, they made a stunning discovery. While the B-29 raids and the great carrier battles had been spectacular and decisive, the silent, invisible war waged by the submarine force had been equally, if not more, devastating. Their final report concluded that the submarine campaign against Japan's merchant shipping was one of the primary factors that led to its unconditional surrender. It had crippled their industry, starved their military, and brought their nation to the brink of collapse before the first atomic bomb was ever dropped. The ultimate irony is that Japan, a proud maritime empire, a nation of islands utterly dependent on the sea, was brought to its knees by a naval blockade, the very weapon they thought they could inflict on others. The Japanese leaders, who had gathered in Tokyo in 1941 and mocked the feeble American submarine force, had made a catastrophic error. They had failed to understand their enemy. They had seen the obsolete boats and the flawed torpedoes, but they had not seen the industrial colossus that stood behind them, a nation that could build over 200 state-of-the-art fleet submarines in 4 years, a nation that could identify a catastrophic technological failure and have the scientific and engineering depth to fix it in the middle of a war, a nation that could produce a new generation of aggressive, brilliant commanders who would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. They had celebrated a single tactical victory at Pearl Harbor, never realizing that they had awakened a sleeping giant, and in doing so, had signed the. The year 1944 was not merely a continuation of the submarine war, it was its apotheosis. The confluence of corrected torpedoes, superior fleet boats, advanced electronics, and a new generation of aggressive skippers created a perfect storm of lethality. But there was another element, a secret weapon so powerful and so closely guarded that most of the submarine crews themselves never knew it existed. It was a weapon not of steel or explosives, but of intellect and information. It was the work of a few hundred brilliant, anonymous men and women working in a soundproofed basement in Pearl Harbor, and their work would turn the vast, opaque Pacific Ocean into a transparent fishbowl for the American submarine force. This weapon was Ultra, the Allied code name for the intelligence derived from breaking Japan's most secret naval codes. The story of U-Ultra is a saga in itself, a war of the mind that paralleled the war of the machine. The primary target for the code breakers of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor was the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25. This was a super-enciphered code of immense complexity, a two-part system involving a codebook of tens of thousands of 5-digit number groups, which were then further scrambled using a separate book of random additive numbers. The Japanese believed it to be unbreakable. They were wrong. Through a combination of brilliant cryptanalysis, painstaking statistical analysis, and a few lucky captures of codebooks from wrecked Japanese vessels, the codebreakers, led by the legendary Commander Joseph Rochefort, had achieved a partial break of JN-25, even before the Battle of Midway. By 1944, Station Hypo and its counterparts in Washington and Australia were reading Japanese naval message traffic with an almost real-time fluency. They knew the composition of convoys leaving port, their departure times, their intended routes, their speeds, and their destinations. This torrent of priceless information was then sanitized to protect its source and relayed to Admiral Lockwood's headquarters. An intelligence officer would then look at the Ultra board, a massive map of the Pacific, showing the real-time locations of every American submarine on patrol. He would then vector the nearest available submarine to an intercept point. The result was a campaign of almost supernatural efficiency. A submarine skipper, patrolling his designated grid square, in the middle of an empty ocean, would suddenly receive a cryptic, coded message from Pearl Harbor. Proceed to position X at speed Y. Expect customers. He didn't know how headquarters knew, and he was forbidden to ask. He simply followed his orders, and as if by magic, a day or two later, the masts of a fat, juicy Japanese convoy would appear on the horizon, exactly where headquarters said they would be. It was as one skipper later put it, like God was our lookout. This intelligence advantage turned the American submarine from a patient, lurking predator into a guided missile. It eliminated the long, fruitless weeks of searching and allowed the boats to conserve their fuel and their crew's energy for the attack. The mathematics of this advantage were devastating. A submarine operating on its own might spend 80% of its patrol searching for a target and 20% attacking. An ultra-vectored submarine could flip that ratio, spending its time maneuvering into the perfect ambush position for a target it knew was coming. The Japanese, for their part, never fully grasped the extent of the compromise. They knew their convoys were being sunk at an alarming rate, but they attributed it to bad luck, superior American radar, or spies in their own ports. Their own cultural and institutional arrogance made it difficult for them to believe that their sacred codes could be so thoroughly broken by the inferior Americans. They would periodically change the additive books for the JN-25 code, causing temporary blackouts for the Allied code breakers. But the underlying codebook remained the same for long periods, and the brilliant minds at Station Hypo were usually able to break back into the new system within a matter of weeks, sometimes days. This intelligence failure, as much as their material and doctrinal failures, doomed their merchant marine. The men who had to turn this intelligence into action were the submariners themselves, and the crucible where these men were forged was the Submarine School at New London, Connecticut. It was a brutal, unforgiving institution, a gauntlet of intellectual and psychological pressure, designed to weed out anyone who was not perfectly suited to the unique horrors of the silent service. Prospective officers and enlisted men were subjected to a barrage of technical training. They had to master the intricate plumbing of the ballast and trim systems, the complex wiring of the electrical plant, and the brutal mechanics of the massive diesel engines. They were locked in a diving chamber and subjected to the crushing pressure of the deep to see if they would panic. They were forced to make free ascents from 100 feet down in a water-filled tower, learning to exhale all the way to the surface to keep their lungs from exploding.
But the most important test was psychological. A submarine is a closed world, a steel tube packed with 80 men, high explosives, and 1 million gallons of diesel fuel. There is no escape. A single mistake, a moment of panic, could kill everyone. The training at New London was designed to find the men who could live and work under this constant, unrelenting pressure, the men who could function with calm, cold professionalism when the world outside their hull was being torn apart by the hammer blows of depth charges. Out of every 100 men who volunteered for the submarine service, Lured by the promise of better pay and better food, only a handful would make it through. Those who did were a special breed, an elite fraternity bound together by a quiet, shared understanding of the risks they faced. Life on a war patrol was a strange mixture of mind-numbing boredom and moments of sheer adrenaline-fueled terror. For weeks on end, the routine was the same. The boat would run on the surface at night, under the power of its 4 massive diesel engines, their throbbing roar a constant companion, charging the huge batteries that were the lifeblood of the submarine. The air would be fresh, and the men off watch would gather on the bridge for a cigarette, staring up at the vast star-filled dome of the Pacific sky. Then, at the first hint of dawn, the dreaded call would come from the officer of the deck, "Dive, dive." The klaxon horn would blare, and the crew would spring into action. The bridge would be cleared, the hatches sealed, and the bow and stern planes angled down. The main ballast tanks would be flooded, and the 500-ton boat would slip beneath the waves, into the silent blue-gray world of the deep. The days were spent submerged, running on the silent electric motors, conserving every amp of battery power. The air would grow foul, thick with the smell of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of the carbon dioxide scrubbers. The temperature and humidity would climb, turning the inside of the steel hull into a sweltering jungle. Condensation would drip from the overhead pipes, and a thin film of oil would seem to coat every surface. The men would move about in a state of enforced quiet, speaking in low tones, their world reduced to the hum of the gyros and the ping of the sonar. This was the boring part, the endless waiting. Men would read, play cards, listen to the phonograph, and try to sleep in their cramped bunks, a practice known as hitting the rack, which was the primary method of conserving the boat's precious oxygen supply. Then would come the call from the sonar operator, the man with the golden ears, high-speed screws, bearing 090. And in an instant, the boredom would vanish, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. The skipper would be on the periscope, his voice a low, calm monotone, upscope, bearing, mark, range, mark, angle on the bow, mark. In the conning tower, the officers and men of the fire control party would be a whirlwind of focused activity, their hands flying across the dials of the torpedo data computer. Below in the torpedo rooms, the torpedo juice hydraulic oil would be whining as the heavy 21-foot-long fish were loaded into the tubes. The outer doors of the torpedo tubes would be opened, and the command would come final bearing and shoot. The skipper would wait for the perfect moment, for the crosshairs in his periscope to align with the center of the target, and then he would give the order, fire 1, fire 2. With each firing, the boat would shudder as a blast of compressed air ejected the torpedo from its tube. And then came the worst part of all, the waiting. The crew would count the seconds, their ears straining to hear the most beautiful sound in the world, the solid satisfying thump of a warhead hitting steel, followed by the deep rumbling boom of the explosion. But if they scored a hit, they knew what was coming next. The convoy's escorts would be turning towards them, their sonar pinging, their depth charges ready. The experience of a depth charge attack was the ultimate test of a submariner's courage. It was a personal, intimate kind of hell. The first indication would be the sound of the Japanese destroyer's propellers, a swish 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 that grew louder and louder until it was directly overhead. Then came the click of the depth charge release mechanism, and then the explosion. It was not a sound, it was a physical blow, a massive hammer striking the hull, making the entire boat ring like a bell. Lights would shatter, cork insulation would rain down, and pipes would burst, spraying the crew with icy water or hot oil. The boat would be thrown about, and men would be slammed against the bulkheads. And it was never just one. A well-executed attack could involve a pattern of a dozen or more depth charges, bracketing the submarine in a three-dimensional cage of explosions. All the crew could do was rig for deep submergence, run silent and pray. The skipper would try to maneuver the boat into a thermal layer, a boundary between cold and warm water that could bend the Japanese sonar beams. The crew would be at their stations, silent, listening to the groaning of the hull as the immense water pressure tried to crush it. They knew that a single cracked seam, a single failed valve, could mean a quick cold death. This could go on for hours, a relentless psychological torture. But if they survived, if they endured, they would surface that night, battered but alive, report their kills to Pearl Harbor, and begin the hunt again. It was in this crucible of boredom and terror that the legends of the submarine force were forged. The year 1944 saw an explosion of tactical brilliance and raw courage. The skippers of Convoy College became masters of their craft. Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang was perhaps the most brilliant of them all. His tactics were audacious, almost suicidal. He favored the night surface attack, using the Tang's high surface speed to race ahead of a convoy, then turn and attack it head-on as it steamed towards him. On his third patrol, he sank a record 8 ships. On his fifth and final patrol, in the Formosa Strait, he performed a feat that has never been equaled. In a chaotic night battle, he weaved the Tang through the middle of a massive convoy, firing torpedoes from both his bow and stern tubes, sinking an incredible 10 ships. The Tang's final tragic end was a testament to the dangers these men faced. Its last torpedo, a faulty Mark 18, malfunctioned and ran in a circle, striking the Tang and sending her to. Then there was Eugene B. Fluckey of the USS Barb. Fluckey was an innovator, a man who saw the submarine not just as a ship killer, but as a platform for unconventional warfare. On one patrol, he modified his submarine to carry rockets, which he used to bombard Japanese shore installations. On his final patrol, in the shallow waters off the coast of Japan itself, he performed one of the most audacious acts of the war. Spotting a Japanese supply train running along the coastline, Fluckey sent a shore party of 8 of his crew members ashore in a rubber raft. These men, armed with scuttling charges, crept inland, planted their explosives under the railroad tracks, and blew up a 16-car train. It was the only ground combat operation conducted on the Japanese home islands during the war, and it was carried out by a submarine crew. For this and other acts, Fluckey was awarded the Medal of Honor. And there was Samuel D. Dealey of the USS Harder. Dealey was a specialist, a man who hunted the most dangerous game of all, Japanese destroyers. In a legendary 6-day period in June of 1944, a period that would become known as Dealey's Destroyer Week, the Harder single-handedly sank 4 Japanese destroyers and heavily damaged a 5th. His tactic was the down-the-throat shot, a maneuver of almost unbelievable nerve. Instead of running from a charging destroyer, Dealey would hold his position, wait for the enemy ship to get to point-blank range, and then fire a spread of torpedoes directly at its bow. He was playing a deadly game of chicken, and he never flinched. Dealey and his crew were lost on their next patrol, but their legend had already been written. While these American heroes were rewriting the book on submarine warfare, the Japanese were struggling to respond. Their anti-submarine warfare ASW effort was a case of too little, too late. Their entire naval doctrine, which had dismissed the submarine threat, had left them completely unprepared. They lacked the mass production capacity to build the hundreds of escort vessels needed to protect their convoys. The Kaibokan, their primary escort ship, was a decent design, but there were never enough of them, and they were handicapped by inferior technology. Their sonar was years behind American and British models, and they had no effective airborne radar to spot surfaced submarines at night. Their depth charges were too light, and were fused to explode at shallow depths, often detonating harmlessly above a deep-diving American fleet boat. Their tactics were also flawed. The Japanese Navy was obsessed with the offensive spirit. When a submarine was detected, the escort commanders would often abandon their primary mission of protecting the convoy, and go off on a hunter-killer mission, trying to sink the submarine. While they were gone, another American submarine, often working in a coordinated wolf pack, would slip in and attack the now unprotected merchant ships. It was a tactical failure born of cultural arrogance. The human cost of this campaign, for the Japanese, was immense. The men of the Japanese merchant marine, the seinen, were not warriors, but civilian sailors caught in a war they did not ask for. They sailed in slow, poorly armed ships, with little or no escort, knowing that at any moment, a torpedo could send them to a fiery or a watery grave. Their story is one of quiet, forgotten heroism. They sailed with a fatalistic courage, and they died in horrific numbers. Of the approximately 130,000 Japanese merchant seamen who served during the war, over 30,000 were killed, a casualty rate of nearly 25%. The cargo they carried was not just the fuel and steel of the war machine. In the later years of the war, as the Japanese army retreated across the Pacific, these ships were used to transport Allied prisoners of war. These vessels, which would become known as hell ships, were unmarked, overcrowded, and sailed without regard for the safety of the men packed into their holds. American submarines, with no way of knowing their human cargo, would stalk and sink these ships, resulting in some of the war's worst tragedies at sea. Thousands of American, British, and Australian POWs died, victims of both Japanese brutality and the terrible indiscriminate efficiency of the American submarine campaign. It is the darkest and most tragic chapter of the Silent Service's history. Even in the arena of the decisive battle, the one place the Japanese thought they were supreme, the American submarines delivered devastating blows. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the USS Albacore torpedoed and sank the brand new Japanese aircraft carrier Taiho, the flagship of Admiral Ozawa's fleet. A few hours later, the USS Kavala sank the veteran carrier Shikaku, one of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. 2 of the most powerful warships in the world, sunk by 2 lone submarines, a perfect illustration of the shifting balance of naval power. And in November 1944, the USS Archer Fish achieved the ultimate prize, sinking the gigantic 72,000-ton aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest warship in the world at the time, on her maiden voyage. The sinking of the Shinano was a perfect microcosm of the submarine war. The Archer Fish, guided by an ultra-intercept, found the massive carrier on a secret, nighttime transit. The Shinano's crew, overconfident and poorly trained, failed to. By the spring of 1945, the submarine force had largely worked itself out of a job. The vast Pacific, which had once teemed with Japanese shipping, was now an empty ocean. There were simply no more targets to sink. In the final phase of the war, the submarines took on new roles. One of the most important was that of the lifeguard. Submarines were stationed along the flight paths of the B-29s that were now firebombing Japan from the newly captured Marianas Islands. When a bomber was damaged by flak and had to ditch in the ocean, the crew knew that a lifeguard submarine was waiting below to pick them up. The story of future President George H.W. Bush, shot down over the Pacific and rescued by the USS Finback, is the most famous example of this life-saving mission. Hundreds of American airmen were saved in this way, another testament to the versatility and importance of the submarine force. In the final months of the war, Admiral Lockwood conceived of one last audacious campaign. The Sea of Japan, which was believed to be heavily mined and impenetrable, was the last sanctuary for the remnants of the Japanese merchant fleet. Lockwood planned a secret invasion. Using newly developed mine-avoidance sonar, a wolf pack of 9 submarines, in an operation codenamed Operation Barney, slipped through the Tsushima Strait and into the Sea of Japan. For 10 days they rampaged through this previously safe body of water, sinking dozens of ships and proving that there was no corner of the ocean where the Japanese were safe. When the war ended and the American analysts of the Strategic Bombing Survey began to sift through the wreckage of the Japanese Empire, they made a stunning discovery. While the B-29 raids and the great carrier battles had been spectacular and decisive, the silent, invisible war waged by the submarine force had been equally, if not more, devastating. Their final report concluded that the submarine campaign against Japan's merchant shipping was one of the primary factors that led to its unconditional surrender. It had crippled their industry, starved their military, and brought their nation to the brink of collapse before the first atomic bomb was ever dropped. The ultimate irony is that Japan, a proud maritime empire, a nation of islands utterly dependent on the sea, was brought to its knees by a naval blockade, the very weapon they thought they could inflict on others. The Japanese leaders who had gathered in Tokyo in 1941 and mocked the feeble American submarine force had made a catastrophic error. They had failed to understand their enemy. They had seen the obsolete boats and the flawed torpedoes, but they had not seen the industrial colossus that stood behind them, a nation that could build over 200 state-of-the-art fleet submarines in 4 years, a nation that could identify a catastrophic technological failure and have the scientific and engineering depth to fix it in the middle of a war, a nation that could produce a new generation of aggressive, brilliant commanders who would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. They had celebrated a single tactical victory at Pearl Harbor, never realizing that they had awakened a sleeping giant, and in doing so had signed their own empire's death warrant. The silent, unseen, and once mocked American submarine force had not just won a battle, it had won a war of strangulation, a victory so complete and so absolute
but it remains one of the most decisive campaigns in the history of naval warfare.